The cold wind howled through the narrow streets, twisting its way into every nook and crevice, carrying whispers of secrets long forgotten. Emily sat in her cozy living room, nestled beneath a thick woolen shawl. A book lay open in her hands, though she wasn't reading it. Her thoughts were drifting, lost in the quiet stillness of the evening, until a sudden noise broke the silence. 3 sharp knocks on the door echoed through the apartment. Emily frowned, her brow knitting in confusion. It was almost midnight. Who could possibly be visiting her at this hour? A shiver ran down her spine as she stood, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She moved cautiously to the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She peered through the peephole. The sight made her gasp, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a man, his silhouette half-shadowed in the flickering streetlight. Something about him seemed familiar, impossibly so. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The face she saw was worn, gaunt, and weathered by time, but there was no mistaking who it was. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hello, Emily," the man said, his voice strained, a tired smile twitching at his lips. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the shock of recognition. It was her brother who had disappeared a decade ago, without a word, without a trace. Emily stepped aside, letting him in without a word. She could hardly think, her mind racing with questions, emotions overwhelming her. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the empty hall. Ethan stepped into the small living room, his eyes darting around as if to confirm they were alone. He looked different, thinner, worn out, like a man who had been to the ends of the earth and barely found his way back. His hair was longer, and his clothes were worn, with patches frayed at the edges. But those eyes, those intense, determined eyes, were the same as she remembered from when they were kids, playing detective in their backyard. Emily finally found her voice, her emotions coming out all at once. "Ethan, where have you been? Do you know how long it's been? How could you just—" "Emily, I know," he interrupted, his voice a mix of exhaustion and pleading. He held up a hand, shaking his head. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I don't have much time to explain right now." Emily frowned, her confusion turning to frustration. "What do you mean, you don't have time? You've been gone for 10 years, Ethan. You owe me an explanation." Ethan sank into the old armchair near the window, resting his head in his hands. He looked up at her, eyes filled with an intensity that made her pause. "I need your help, Emily. They're still after me." "Who?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Who is after you, Ethan? What have you gotten yourself into?" He swallowed, his eyes darting to the window as if he expected someone to burst through at any moment. "I can't tell you everything right now, but I promise I will explain. Just, please trust me. For now, I need a place to stay, just for a few days. I can't be out there anymore." Emily looked at her brother, her heart aching with a strange mix of fear, hope, and worry. He looked desperate, a shadow of the Ethan she used to know, but she couldn't deny him, not after all these years. She sighed deeply, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "All right," she said quietly, her voice softening. "You can stay, but you'd better start talking soon, Ethan. You owe me that much." Ethan nodded, relief flooding his face. "Thank you, Em," he said, using the old nickname that tugged at her heart. "I promise, I won't let you down again." Emily took a step towards him, sitting down on the edge of the couch opposite the chair. She stared at her brother, trying to piece together the mystery of his return. "Ethan," she began again, softer this time, "are you in danger?" He looked away, his eyes fixed on the floor. He seemed to weigh his words before he finally spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "Yes, but I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." Emily's eyes filled with tears. The brother she remembered had always been the strong one, always protecting her, even when they were children. And now, after all these years, here he was again, still trying to shield her from whatever darkness he had brought into their lives. "Whoever they are, Ethan, we'll figure it out. Together," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes shining with something close to hope. He reached across the small space, taking her hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but filled with emotion. "I can't do this alone." For the first time in a decade, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she had her brother back, and whatever it was he had brought with him, they would face it together. The wind howled once more outside, but the warmth of the room seemed to fight it off. Emily watched as Ethan leaned back in the armchair, exhaustion taking hold. She knew there would be danger. That much was clear from a haunted look in her brother's eyes. But for now, she let herself hold on to the hope that together, they could finally put to rest the nightmares of the past. A week had passed since Ethan's sudden reappearance, and Emily's world had turned upside down. She had done everything to protect her brother, keeping him hidden in the spare room, locking the windows at night, and drawing the curtains tight so no one could see inside. Her once quiet life was now consumed by constant vigilance and a growing sense of unease. Ethan was restless, always peering through the curtains, his eyes shadowed by worry. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was always about the same thing. They're still out there. Emily tried her best to go about her daily routines, but nothing felt the same. Even her trips to the grocery store, once a mundane task, felt like she was being watched. And she was right. It was late one evening, and Emily was returning home from the store, a bag of groceries cradled in her arms. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the streets were quiet, bathed in a soft orange glow from the streetlights. She turned the corner onto her street, her eyes catching a movement in the shadows of an alley. Her heart skipped a beat. There, barely visible in the dim light, stood a tall, thin man. He was partially hidden, leaning against the wall of the narrow alley, but she could see enough to recognize him. She had seen him before, lingering in the shadows, always nearby, always watching. Emily's grip on the grocery bag tightened. She had to know. She couldn't keep living in fear without understanding why. She took a deep breath, her feet moving towards the alley almost of their own accord. "Hey," she called out, her voice more forceful than she felt. The man didn't move. He remained a dark figure against the brick wall, his head turned slightly in her direction. She swallowed hard and stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Why are you following us?" The man still didn't respond. He simply watched her, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Emily could see the glint of his eyes beneath it, and something in his gaze made her stomach twist. He was completely calm, as if her questions were of no consequence to him. "I said, leave us alone," she yelled, her voice echoing off the brick walls. A couple of passers-by turned to glance her way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. The man finally moved, only slightly, a subtle shift of his head, almost as if he were acknowledging her. But then, just as quickly, he turned and disappeared deeper into the alley, swallowed by the shadows. Emily stood there, her breath coming fast, her heart pounding in her chest. She had wanted answers, but now all she had was more fear. Whoever that man was, he was watching them, and he wasn't going away. When she finally arrived back at her apartment, her hands were trembling so badly that she struggled to fit her key into the lock. She opened the door and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind her. Ethan, who had been sitting by the window, immediately turned at the noise. His eyes were wild, his face pale. "Emily, what happened?" he asked, standing up, his voice thick with concern. Emily put the grocery bag down on the kitchen counter, her back still pressed against the door. She looked at her brother, her eyes wide. He was there, Ethan, in the alley, the man who's been watching us. Ethan's expression darkened, and he walked quickly to her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. What did he look like? Did he say anything? Emily shook her head, her breath still uneven. No, he didn't say anything. He just stared. It was like he wanted me to know he was there, but he wasn't scared of me at all. Ethan's jaw clenched, and he turned to look out the window, pulling back the curtain just a fraction to peer outside. "They're getting closer," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Who are they, Ethan?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. She could feel tears stinging her eyes, a week's worth of fear and uncertainty welling up inside her. "Why are they after you? Why are they following us?" Ethan turned back to her, his expression softening for a moment. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the secret he carried. I promise I'll tell you everything. Just not yet. Not until it's safe. Emily shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. Not safe? Ethan, it's already not safe. I need to know what's going on. I need to understand why these people want you. Ethan's eyes met hers, the intensity in them softening just slightly. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. It's about something I found, Emily. Something I shouldn't have. These people, they think I have something valuable, something that could change everything. And they want it back. Emily frowned, her mind racing. What is it? What did you find? Ethan looked away, his gaze distant. I can't say right now. It's too dangerous for you to know. But I swear, I'm going to make this right. Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away angrily. I just want you to be okay, Ethan. I want us to be okay. Ethan pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. We will be Em. I promise you. I'm going to keep you safe, no matter what it takes. Emily closed her eyes, resting her head on her brother's shoulder. She wanted to believe him, but the fear in her heart made it hard. The man in the alley was still out there, and until she knew what they were up against, she knew she couldn't rest easy. After a moment, Ethan pulled away, his face set with determination. We need to be ready. We have to be careful, Emily. They're watching us, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Emily nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Then we'll be ready. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Ethan gave her a small, sad smile. Together, he echoed. He turned back to the window, his eyes scanning the dark street below, while Emily tried to steady her breathing. She knew now that whatever her brother had stumbled into was dangerous, and whoever was after him wasn't going to give up. But she also knew she couldn't abandon Ethan. No matter what they were up against, she was ready to fight. For him, for herself, for the life they both deserved. The night was silent again, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emily knew this was just the beginning, that the man in the alley and whoever else was out there wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But for now, she had Ethan by her side, and that was enough to keep her moving forward, one step at a time. The night was restless, punctuated by the sounds of cars passing on the street outside and the occasional creak of the old apartment settling. Emily had barely slept since Ethan's return. She could hear him pacing in the living room, his footsteps light but insistent. It had become a familiar sound, one that echoed his unease and left her feeling on edge. As dawn began to break, Emily finally decided she couldn't lie in bed any longer, staring at the ceiling. She slipped out from beneath her blankets, her feet cold against the hardwood floor as she tiptoed towards the living room. Ethan was slouched in the armchair, his head resting against his hand, his eyes closed. He must have fallen asleep mid-thought, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Emily watched him for a moment, her heart aching. He looked different. Older, more worn than she remembered. The Ethan she had known had always been full of life, with a mischievous smile and an unwavering sense of purpose. Now, all she saw was the burden of secrets and the fear that chased him. As she turned towards the closet to grab a blanket to drape over her brother, her eyes caught something. It was a small leather-bound journal, peeking out of Ethan's partially open bag. The leather was age, the corners worn and the edges slightly frayed, as if it had been carried a long way. Emily hesitated. She knew she shouldn't look. Ethan had been adamant about not sharing too much, warning her that it was too dangerous. But the mystery of it all, the fear, the uncertainty, the shadowy figures that seemed to linger around every corner, it was too much. She needed to know. Slowly, she knelt down and carefully pulled the journal from the bag. She glanced over at Ethan, his breathing steady, still asleep. She sat on the floor, the journal resting in her lap. Taking a deep breath, she opened it. The pages were filled with notes in Ethan's messy handwriting. Maps, strange symbols, and what looked like coordinates. Some pages were filled with lists, names she didn't recognize, and scribbles that seemed frantic. The ink was smudged in places, as if the pages had been hastily closed before it was dry. Her eyes caught on a phrase scrawled in the margin. The key to everything lies beneath the broken house. Emily frowned, her mind racing. What broken house? She flipped through more pages, her eyes widening at a sketch of an address she recognized, a place on the outskirts of town, a house she remembered passing by during childhood. It had always been abandoned, a shell of a place, crumbling and forgotten. Suddenly, Ethan stirred, and Emily's heart jumped. She snapped the journal shut, her hands shaking. Ethan's eyes blinked open, bleary with exhaustion. But when he saw her crouched by his bag, his expression shifted immediately. He pushed himself up, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the journal in her hands. "Emily," he said, his voice low and tense. "What are you doing?" Emily swallowed, guilt washing over her. She slowly stood, holding the journal out to him. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I had to know. I can't keep living like this, afraid and in the dark. Please, you have to tell me what's going on." Ethan took the journal from her, his fingers brushing against the worn leather as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, though his eyes remained clouded with worry. "I told you it was dangerous, Em. The less you know, the safer you are." "Safe?" Emily shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Ethan, we're not safe. Not with strange men lurking outside, not with you constantly looking over your shoulder. I need to know what we're dealing with." Ethan hesitated, his eyes studying her. He finally nodded, a reluctant acceptance in his gaze. "Okay, but you have to understand. Once you know, there's no turning back." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "I understand." Ethan motioned for her to sit, and they both settled down on the floor, the journal resting between them. He opened it to a page with a faded map, his finger tracing a line drawn in black ink. "This journal," he began, "belongs to someone very powerful. It was supposed to be destroyed, but I found it before they could do that. It contains information on, well, let's just say it's about things that shouldn't exist. Secrets, dangerous ones. And the people who lost this journal, they want it back badly." Emily's eyes followed his finger as he traced the map, leading to a circled location. "The broken house," she said softly, remembering the note she had read. Ethan nodded. "That's where we need to go. There's something hidden there, something that could change everything. It's why they're after me, because I know what they're hiding, and I have the key to finding it." Emily's breath caught, and she stared at her brother, the weight of his words settling over her. "So, what do we do?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes softening. "We go there. We find whatever is hidden before they do. But Emily, it's dangerous. Once we do this, there's no turning back." Emily nodded, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. She had spent the last week living in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for something terrible to happen. If there was a chance they could get ahead of whatever was chasing them, she was willing to take it. "We do it together," she said, her voice steady. Ethan smiled, a ghost of the smile she remembered from their childhood, and he nodded. Together. As the morning light streamed in through the curtains, the fear that had clung to Emily seemed to ease, just slightly. They had a plan. A dangerous, uncertain plan, but a plan nonetheless. And as long as she had Ethan by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Ethan closed the journal and slipped it back into his bag, standing and offering his hand to help Emily up. "We'll leave tonight. We need to be careful. They're always watching." Emily took his hand, pulling herself up. She looked at her brother, the worry lines etched into his face, the weariness in his eyes. She knew that whatever they were about to face wouldn't be easy, but for the first time she felt a flicker of hope. They were taking control of their fate, instead of letting fear dictate their every move. "Tonight, then," she said, her voice resolute. Ethan nodded, a spark of determination lighting in his eyes. Tonight. And with that, they began preparing for whatever lay ahead, the weight of the secrets between them heavy, but the hope of answers and freedom driving them forward. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in twilight as Emily and Ethan drove towards the edge of town. The road wound away from the city, the lights growing sparser until they were surrounded by darkness, interrupted only by the occasional streetlight or distant farmhouse. Emily kept her eyes on the road, her fingers gripping the wheel tightly, the anticipation making her palms sweat. Ethan sat beside her, staring out the window, the journal resting on his lap. He had been quiet for most of the drive, his face tense, eyes scanning the dark landscape as if expecting danger to leap out at any moment. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Emily asked, her voice breaking the silence. Her eyes flicked to the map that Ethan had unfolded on the dashboard, showing the abandoned house at the outskirts. "Yeah, this is it," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "It's supposed to be hidden out here. Not many people come this way anymore." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The abandoned house was a relic from their childhood, a place they had driven by many times, its crumbling facade standing as a monument to neglect. They had always heard rumors about it, stories of ghosts and strange happenings, the kind of things that kept kids up at night. But now it seemed there was a more sinister truth behind those old tales. As they turned down a dirt road, Emily spotted the silhouette of the house in the distance. It stood alone, tall and dark against the night sky, its roof partially caved in, the windows boarded up. The wind whistled through the empty fields around it, carrying a chill that made her shiver. Emily parked the car a few yards away from the house, killing the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air seemed to hum with anticipation, the house looming before them like a shadowy beast. "Ready?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence, his eyes meeting hers. Emily took a deep breath, nodding. "Let's do this." They climbed out of the car, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel as they approached the front of the house. The porch steps creaked beneath their weight, and Emily winced at the noise, feeling as though they were announcing their presence to whoever, or whatever, might be watching. Ethan reached into his bag, pulling out a crowbar. He slipped the metal into the narrow gap between the front door and the frame, pushing hard. The door groaned, the old wood splintering, until it finally gave way with a loud crack. "Come on," Ethan said, nodding towards the darkness beyond. Emily followed him inside, her flashlight flickering to life and illuminating the room. The house was even more dilapidated on the inside. Dust hung thick in the air, and broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. Emily could feel the weight of the past here, a place long forgotten, where time had simply stopped. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan moved forward, shining his flashlight around the room, the beam bouncing off old picture frames and shattered glass. "There should be a hidden door," he said, more to himself than to her, "somewhere under the staircase." Emily followed him, her flashlight illuminating the shadows as they moved towards the stairs. The staircase was narrow, the wood creaking beneath their weight as they stepped closer. Ethan knelt down, running his fingers along the base of the stairs, feeling for something. Suddenly, his fingers stopped. He glanced up at Emily, his eyes meeting hers, and then he nodded. "Here." He pulled at a panel beneath the stairs, the old wood shifting, revealing a narrow door hidden behind it. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It looked like something out of a movie, a secret entrance to a place that had been long hidden. "Help me with this," Ethan said, his voice low. Emily knelt beside him, her fingers trembling as they worked together to pull the door open. The door gave way, revealing a set of steep stairs leading down into darkness. A cold draft rose from the opening, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Ethan switched on his flashlight, shining it down the stairs. "Stay close," he said, glancing back at Emily. "Don't have to tell me twice," she muttered, her voice tinged with nervousness as she followed him down the stairs. The cellar was small, its ceiling low enough that Ethan had to stoop slightly as they moved. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old glass jars and dusty books. Emily's flashlight flickered over the jars, revealing the murky liquid inside, some filled with strange objects, others covered in grime so thick she couldn't see through. "This is it," Ethan said, stopping at the far end of the cellar. A small desk sat against the wall, its surface cluttered with papers and a few rusted tools. Ethan knelt, opening a drawer, and pulled out a velvet-wrapped object. Emily leaned closer, her eyes widening as he carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a brass key, intricately designed, its surface covered in delicate engravings. It looked old, almost ancient, with an aura that seemed almost mystical. "What is it?" Emily whispered, her eyes fixed on the key. Ethan stared at it, his expression a mix of awe and fear. "This is what they want," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's the key to something they should never find." Emily looked at her brother, her heart pounding. "Why is it so important? What does it open?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm not entirely sure, but I know it's powerful. And in the wrong hands." He trailed off, his expression darkening. Suddenly, a noise came from upstairs, the sound of a door slamming, followed by footsteps. Emily's heart stopped, her eyes going wide as she looked at Ethan. "They're here," she whispered. Ethan's face hardened, and he quickly wrapped the key back in the velvet cloth, shoving it into his bag. He grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her towards a narrow door at the back of the cellar. "We need to go. Now." They pushed through the door, merging into the woods behind the house. The trees were dense, the branches tangled together overhead, blocking out most of the moonlight. They ran, their feet pounding against the forest floor, the cold air biting at their skin. Emily's heart raced, her breath coming in gasps as they ran deeper into the woods. She glanced back, her flashlight flickering across the dark shapes of the trees. She could hear the voices behind them, growing louder, closer. "Ethan," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. Ethan tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes focused ahead. "Keep moving, Em. We have to keep moving." They ran until the trees began to thin, revealing an old rusted fence. Ethan helped Emily over, the metal groaning beneath their weight. Once on the other side, they kept running, the voices behind them fading into the distance. Finally, they reached an old shack, hidden deep in the woods. Ethan pushed the door open, and they stumbled inside, collapsing onto the dirt floor, panting, terrified. Ethan looked at Emily, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Whatever happens, Emily," he said, his voice shaking, "you keep that key safe, no matter what." Emily nodded, her hands trembling. "I promise." They sat there in silence, the darkness closing in around them. The world outside seemed a million miles away, and for the first time, Emily realized just how deep they were in this, how dangerous it all truly was. And yet, despite the fear, she felt a strange sense of resolve. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Whatever secrets lay hidden, whatever danger lurked ahead, she was ready to face it, together with Ethan, until the very end. Emily's hands trembled as she held the key, its cold surface pressing into her palm. The brass was smooth and intricately engraved, and even without knowing its purpose, she could feel the weight of its importance. Ethan's words still echoed in her ears. "Whatever happens, keep it safe." She clenched her fist around it, trying to steady her breath. Suddenly, a sound echoed from upstairs, a door slamming open, followed by hurried footsteps. The noise reverberated through the walls of the old shack, and Emily's heart stopped. She looked at Ethan, her eyes wide with fear. "They found us," Ethan whispered, his face going pale. He turned to Emily, grabbing her by the arm. "We need to move. Now." Without hesitation, Ethan pushed open the back door of the shack, and they slipped into the darkness of the forest beyond. The night was cold, the air biting at their exposed skin as they ran. The trees loomed around them, their branches casting long, ghostly shadows under the dim moonlight. Emily struggled to keep up, her legs feeling heavy, her lungs burning with each breath. She could hear the voices behind them, men shouting orders, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Panic rose in her chest as the realization of just how close they were hit her. "Ethan, they're gaining on us," Emily panted, her voice barely audible over the sound of their pounding feet. Ethan looked back, his face set with determination. He tightened his grip on her hand. "Just keep moving. We can lose them." They weaved through the forest, dodging branches and leaping over fallen logs. The woods seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on them from every side. Emily stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and she fell hard to the ground, the key slipping from her grasp and landing a few feet away. Pain shot up her leg as she hit the dirt, her knee scraping against a jagged rock. Emily! Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his eyes wide with concern. He quickly pulled her up, his eyes darting towards the direction of the approaching voices. I lost the key," Emily stammered, her voice cracking. She looked around frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he swept it over the forest floor. The glint of brass caught his eye, and he lunged for it, his fingers closing around the key just as the voices came closer, echoing through the darkness. "Got it," he said, his voice tight with urgency. He pulled Emily to her feet, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "Can you run?" Emily winced, nodding despite the sharp pain in her knee. "I think so." "Come on, we're almost there," Ethan said, wrapping an arm around her for support. Together, they moved as quickly as they could, pushing through the thick underbrush. They reached an old rusted fence that separated the woods from the main road. Ethan helped Emily climb over it, the metal groaning under their weight. They landed on the other side, breathless and trembling, and Ethan quickly pulled her to her feet. "Where do we go now?" Emily asked, her voice shaky as she looked around. The road stretched before them, empty and dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. "We need to get to the other side of the woods," Ethan said, glancing behind them. "If we can reach the river, we might be able to lose them." Emily nodded, her legs aching with each step as they started down the road. The voices behind them were still there, growing closer, and she could see flashlights bouncing through the trees as their pursuers moved closer. They ran along the road, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the night. The air was cold, each breath coming in ragged gasps as they pushed forward. Just as they neared the edge of the woods, headlights suddenly cut through the darkness, a vehicle skidding to a stop in front of them. Emily's heart sank. A black SUV, its windows tinted, blocked their path. Two men stepped out, their faces shadowed under the dim light of the street lamp. "Ethan!" Emily shouted, panic rising in her chest. Ethan turned, pulling her towards the tree line. "This way," he yelled. But before they could make it back into the cover of the woods, one of the men lunged forward, grabbing Emily's arm. She screamed, her body twisting as she tried to pull away. "Let her go!" Ethan shouted, charging at the man. He tackled him to the ground, his fists flying. But before he could do any real damage, the other man grabbed Ethan, pulling him off. Emily struggled against the grip on her arm, her heart pounding. She kicked at her captor, managing to land a solid hit on his shin. He cursed, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She stumbled back, her eyes darting towards Ethan, who was still grappling with the second man. "Run, Emily!" Ethan shouted, his voice desperate. Emily's eyes filled with tears, her heart breaking as she watched her brother struggle. She knew she couldn't leave him, but she also knew she had to keep the key safe. That was the only way to make any of this worth it. "I'll come back for you," she yelled, her voice breaking as she turned and ran, her legs carrying her towards the river. She could hear Ethan shouting, his voice echoing behind her, but she forced herself to keep moving, her tears blurring her vision. The forest closed in around her once more, the darkness swallowing her as she ran. Branches scratched at her arms, the cold wind biting at her skin as she pushed forward. She could hear the sound of the river ahead, the rushing water growing louder with each step. She stumbled down the embankment, her feet sliding on the loose dirt, until she reached the edge of the river. The water was dark, the current swift as it rushed past. Emily hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still hear the voices behind her, the men crashing through the forest as they searched for her. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the river, the icy water soaking through her shoes and biting at her skin. She moved quickly, wading into the water until it reached her waist. The current pulled at her, and she fought to keep her balance as she moved towards the opposite bank. She reached the other side, her body trembling from the cold as she pulled herself out of the water. She collapsed onto the riverbank, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body aching. She looked back across the river, her heart aching as she thought of Ethan. She knew she couldn't stay. She had to keep moving, to keep the key safe. But the thought of leaving him behind, of not knowing if he was okay, tore at her. I'll come back for you, Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling as she pushed herself to her feet. I promise. With one last glance at the dark woods across the river, Emily turned and began to move, her body sore, her heart heavy. She didn't know where she was going or how she would ever find her brother again, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't giving up. Not on Ethan, and not on the fight they had started together. The chase had only just begun, and Emily was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the dilapidated shack's wooden walls, casting long golden stripes across the dirt floor. Emily was awake, her body aching from exhaustion, her clothes still damp from her river escape. She had spent the night in an abandoned barn, she found after making her way out of the woods. The air smelled of hay and dust, and she could hear birds chirping somewhere in the distance. It was the first sign of calm after the nightmare of the previous night. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the pain in her muscles. Every inch of her body felt like it had been pushed to its limits. But despite that, she felt a flicker of determination. She was still alive, and more importantly, she still had the key. Emily pulled the brass key from her pocket, staring at the intricate designs that shimmered in the morning light. It was small, but its significance felt monumental, almost as though it pulsed with the secrets it guarded. The thought of Ethan made her chest tighten. She knew he had risked everything to protect her and this key, and now it was her turn to take on that responsibility. She couldn't sit here and do nothing. She needed to take control, to fight back. And to do that, she needed help. Emily's mind wandered to the only person she could trust apart from Ethan, their old family friend, Marcus. He had worked with their father, and growing up, he had always been the one they went to when they needed advice. If anyone could help her figure out what to do next, it would be Marcus. With resolve settling in her chest, she stood up, brushing off the dirt from her jeans. She had a plan now. Find Marcus and together, figure out what this key opened and how to save Ethan. The journey to Marcus's house took hours. Emily had to avoid the main roads, sticking to wooded trails and back routes to make sure she wasn't being followed. Finally, she reached the small cottage at the edge of town. It looked the same as she remembered, cozy, with a small porch and flower beds lining the front. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing Marcus. He looked older than she remembered, his hair grayer, his eyes sharper, but there was a softness in his expression when he recognized her. "Emily?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed in surprise. "What are you doing here, child? You look like you've been through hell." Emily swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with tears she had held back for too long. "I need your help, Marcus. It's about Ethan, and something he found. Something dangerous." Marcus's expression darkened, and he stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "All right, come inside. Let's get you sorted, and then we'll talk." She stepped into the warmth of the house, the familiar scent of herbs and old books enveloping her. Marcus led her to the kitchen, where he set a kettle on the stove and gestured for her to sit at the small wooden table. So he began, turning to face her, his eyes filled with concern. "Tell me everything." Emily took a deep breath, the words tumbling out as she recounted everything. Ethan's sudden reappearance, the men following them, the abandoned house, the key, and the chase through the woods. Marcus listened intently, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. When she finished, she pulled the brass key from her pocket, placing it on the table between them. Marcus picked it up, examining it closely, his eyes narrowing as he traced the intricate designs. "This key," he said slowly, "isn't just any key. It's a master key, a kind used by secret societies to guard their most valuable treasures, the kind of key that people would do anything to possess." He looked up at Emily, his expression grave. Ethan was right. This is dangerous, Emily. If they're willing to chase you both like this, then whatever this key opens is something they can't afford to lose. Emily nodded, her throat tight. "But we can't just keep running, Marcus. They have Ethan. I have to do something. We have to fight back." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You've grown up, kid. You've got your father's spirit." He placed the key back on the table, his eyes meeting hers. "All right. We're going to figure this out together. But you need to understand that once we start down this path, there's no turning back." Emily's heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "I've come this far, and I'm not giving up now. Not when Ethan's life is at stake." Marcus smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "That's what I was hoping to hear." He stood, moving towards the bookshelf in the corner of the room. He pulled down a dusty tome, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. An old map, yellowed with age. He spread it out on the table, pointing to a location circled in red ink. "This," Marcus said, his finger tapping the map, "is an old estate. If my hunch is correct, this is where the people who took Ethan are keeping whatever it is they're hiding. And it's where we need to go if we're going to get your brother back." Emily leaned over the map, her eyes scanning the details. The estate was in a remote area, surrounded by woods and far from any towns. It looked like the kind of place that would be easy to defend and hard to escape from. "Do you think Ethan is there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus sighed, his eyes softening. "I don't know, Emily, but it's the best lead we have. And if we find whatever they're hiding, we might be able to use it to bargain for his release." Emily nodded, her jaw set with determination. She could feel the fear still lurking inside her, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But it was outweighed by her resolve, the need to save her brother, to finish what they had started. "Then let's go," she said, her voice steady. "We'll find this place, and we'll bring Ethan home." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "First, we'll need supplies, and we'll need to be careful. These people aren't going to let us just walk in." He reached across the table, taking Emily's hand and giving it a reassuring squeeze. "But we're not alone. We'll do this together." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest, her heart lifting for the first time in what felt like days. She wasn't alone. She had Marcus, and together, they would find a way to save Ethan. They would uncover the truth behind the key and bring down the people who had turned their lives into a nightmare. As Marcus began making a list of what they would need, Emily looked down at the key, the brass glinting in the morning light. It represented everything they had lost, and everything they still had to fight for. She closed her hand around it, a new resolve settling in her chest. No matter what it took, she was going to get her brother back. She was going to make sure that the people who had torn their lives apart would never hurt anyone again. "Get ready, Ethan," she whispered, her eyes burning with determination. "I'm coming for you." With Marcus by her side, Emily knew they had a long, dangerous journey ahead of them. But for the first time since Ethan had shown up at her door, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel: hope. And with that hope came a fierce determination that nothing, not even the darkest shadows or the most dangerous secrets, could take away from her. She would fight, she would endure, and she would see this through to the very end.